And now, The Uprising Against the East India Company by Arthur Meier Schlesinger. In March 1770, the Townshend duties were repealed by Parliament except the tax on tea, which was retained, so said the king, because there must always be one tax to keep up the right. The news of the partial repeal caused great rejoicing in the great trading towns in the colonies, and the non-importation agreements which had been launched against the Townshend taxes were modified to operate against dutied tea only. Then followed nearly 2 years of calm, unruffled by any further active aggression from the home government or the colonists. The historian has not unnaturally assumed that the Americans true to their professions were engaged during this period in silent and successful enforcement of the boycott against dutied tea, or in other words, in the establishment of their hallowed principle of no taxation without representation. It is necessary to determine the validity of this assumption before it is possible to arrive at a correct understanding of the contest that arose between the colonists and the East India Company in the fall of 1773. Only in 2 parts of British America did the people successfully abstain from the importation and use of duty-laden tea during this period. These places were the chief centers for tea smuggling in America, New York and Philadelphia. Unembarrassed by the presence of the Board of Customs Commissioners, as were their Boston brethren, the enterprising merchants of these ports drove a brisk trade with Holland, Sweden, and Germany, and with the Dutch island of St. Eustatius, for contraband tea, powder, and other supplies, but particularly for the forbidden tea. Lieutenant Governor Colden and Lord Dartmouth exchanged views on the subject, both agreeing in the sentiment that the illicit trade between New York and Holland prevailed to an enormous degree. It is well known, wrote Samuel Seabury in 1774, that little or no tea has been entered at the customs house for several years. All that is imported is smuggled from Holland and the Dutch islands in the West Indies. Gilbert Barclay, a Philadelphia merchant of 16 years' standing, wrote in May 1773 of the extensive smuggling of tea from Holland, France, Sweden, Lisbon, and St. Eustatia in the West Indies. Smuggling has amazingly increased within these 20 years past, asserted a tradesman of Philadelphia. Hutchinson informed Lord Hillsborough that in New York they import scarce any other than Dutch teas. In Rhode Island and Pennsylvania it is little better. Since smuggled tea was cheaper to the consumer than dutied tea, and the profits of the tea dealer were greater, the systematic neglect of the dutied article in New York and Philadelphia was as much in harmony with self-interest as with love of principle, and gave fair occasion for the coining of the epigram that a smuggler and a Whig are cousin Germans. The smuggling merchants experienced little difficulty in getting their teas into America. There were all the secluded landing places which a much indented coastline afforded, and all the tricks which the mind of a resourceful skipper could invent to deceive the customs officials. There were furthermore customs officials who, from lack of reward from the government, did not care to risk the rage of the people, or who, because of the forehandedness of the smugglers, found a rich reward in conniving at the traffic. Colden cited the case of his grandson, recently appointed surveyor and searcher of the port of New York, who was given to understand by interested parties that if he would not be officious in his duty, he might depend upon receiving £1,500 a year. It is difficult in these days of many tempting non-alcoholic beverages to understand the hold of the tea habit on the colonists. The views of some contemporary observers throw some light on the prevalence of tea drinking, as well as the proportion of imported tea which failed to pay the parliamentary duty. Governor Hutchinson, who seems to have furnished the brains for the tea business carried on by his sons at Boston, estimated that the total annual consumption of tea in America was 19,200 chests, or 6,528,000 pounds. For approximately the same period, the amount of tea that paid the duty was about 320,000 pounds. Hutchinson's estimate was evidently wide of the mark, for even Samuel Wharton, who gravely averred that the frontiersmen and many Indians shared the popular habit of imbibing tea twice a day, placed the total consumption at 1.5 million less. The London tea merchant William Palmer judged more dispassionately when he hazarded a figure about half that named by Hutchinson, remarking that Hutchinson's estimate of 19,200 chests is more than has been hitherto annually imported from China by all foreign companies. Assuming Palmer's conservative figure to be approximately correct, the conclusion would seem valid that in a year like 1771, marked by unusually large importations of duty tea, 9/10 of the tea consumed was illicitly imported. The incentive to smuggling existed in spite of the well-intentioned efforts of the British government. The Townshend Act of 1767, though imposing a small import duty of 3 pennies a pound in America, had removed all British import duties from teas exported to America and had thus, for a time at least, reduced the cost of English tea to the American consumer below that of the contraband article. This advantageous situation of English tea could, in the nature of things, continue only so long as the wholesale price of the tea in the English market did not go up, or the price of smuggled tea fall. The former occurred. The East India Company, though not permitted to sell at retail, were permitted to name an upset price at their public auction sales. Treading the edge of a quicksand of bankruptcy and obliged by the Act of 1767, to make good any deficiency in the revenues resulting from the discontinuance of certain tea duties, the company sought to recoup their losses by advancing the upset price of tea. Governor Hutchinson wrote to Lord Hillsborough on August 25th, 1771. If the India Company had continued the sale of their teas at 2 shillings 2 pennies to 2 shillings 4 pennies, as they sold 2 years ago, the Dutch trade would have been over by this time. But now that the teas are at 3 shillings, the illicit traders can afford to lose 1 chest in 3. Meantime, Dutch teas were selling in Holland at from 18 pennies to 2 shillings per pound and paid no import duty into America. Hutchinson urged constantly in his business and political correspondence that by some means or other, the price of teas in England to the exporter ought to be kept nearer to the price in Holland. The next Act of Parliament, dealing with the East India Company, enacted in June 1772, relieved the company from future liability for deficiency in the tea revenues, but granted a drawback of only 3/5 of the English import duties on tea exported to America instead of a complete reimbursement as formerly. This act failed to alter the situation materially. So far as the American dealer in duty teas was concerned, the tea smuggler continued to control the situation, particularly at New York and Philadelphia. And in the period from December 1st, 1770, to the termination of the customs service in 1775, only 874 pounds of duty tea were imported at New York, and 128 pounds at Philadelphia. The situation elsewhere was quite different. Not one mention was found in the newspapers of the remaining provinces of any effort to enforce the non-importation agreement, nor did the popular apathy provoke criticism or protest. Even the arch-radical John Adams could confide to his diary on February 14, 1771, that he had dined at Mr. Hancock's with the members Warren, Church, Cooper, etc., and Mr. Harrison, and spent the whole afternoon and drank green tea from Holland. I hope, but don't know. On January 21st, 1772, the Boston radical Thomas Cushing declared that to place any great dependence upon the virtue of the people in general as to their refraining from the use of any of the duty articles will be in vain. When, in the autumn months of 1773, public sentiment underwent an abrupt and radical change for reasons that will be discussed later, considerable light was thrown on the state of public mind that had existed prior to that time. Thus, in August 1774, Robert Finley was adjudged by the Charles County, Maryland Committee to have fully and satisfactorily exculpated himself of any intention to counteract the resolutions of America because he showed that his orders for duty tea had been sent in the fall of 1773. Likewise, T.C. Williams and Company of Annapolis issued a statement in October 1774 with reference to the tea consigned to them in the Peggy Stewart, in which they declared, "When we ordered this tea in May 1774, we did nothing more than our neighbors. For it is well known that most merchants, both here and in Baltimore, that ordered fall goods, ordered tea as usual. And to our certain knowledge, in the months of April, May, and June last, near 30 chests were imported into the city by different merchants, and the duties paid without the least opposition. We therefore think it hard and a cruel usage that our characters should be thus blasted for only doing what most people in this province that are concerned in trade have likewise done." Newspaper references make it clear that the importation of duty tea had been carried on during the years 1771 to 1773 at Charleston, South Carolina, with absolutely no attempt at concealment. At the public meeting held in December 1773 upon the arrival of the East India Company's ship, it was strongly argued that tea had ever been spontaneously imported and the duty paid, that every subject had an equal right to send that article from the mother country into their province, and therefore it was unreasonable to exclude the Honorable East India Company from the same privilege. Indeed, while the people were still in session, some duty teas on board the tea ship not owned by the East India Company were landed and carted past the meeting place to the stores of private merchants. These contemporary views are abundantly supported by the official figures of the British government on the tea importations into the colonies. At Boston, a total of 373,077 pounds of duty tea was imported from December 1st, 1770 to January 5th, 1773, without articulate protest from the radicals. 300 whole and 55 half chests came in vessels belonging to Mr. John Hancock, the Patriot, stated the Comptroller of Customs at Boston, in a letter of September 29, 1773, to John Pownall, Under Secretary of State in the Colonial Department. In the other provinces of this group, the amount of duty tea imported from December 1st, 1770 to January 5th, 1773 was less in quantity, but probably about equal in proportion to the normal volume of trade. At Rhode Island, the quantity of duty tea entered was 20,833 pounds. At Patuxent, Maryland, 33,304 pounds. At the various Virginia ports, 79,527 pounds. At Charleston, 48,540 pounds. And at Savannah, 12,931 pounds. The total for all provinces, always excepting New York and Pennsylvania, was 580,831 pounds, on which the duty was paid without arousing comment. The conclusion seems valid that from the latter part of 1770 to about the middle of 1773, the sacrosanct principle of no taxation without representation received but a doubtful application in two provinces and was totally ignored throughout the most of British America. What then produced a revolution of sentiment in the leading commercial towns in the fall of 1773 and created a public opinion determined to oppose the introduction of duty tea at almost any cost? The chief animating cause was the passage of a new statute of Parliament in May 1773 affecting the East India Company. This act involved no new infringement of the constitutional or natural rights of the Americans so far as taxation was concerned. Continuing the 3-penny import duty in America, it provided that a full drawback of English import duties should be given on all teas, reshipped to America, thus restoring the arrangement which had existed under the Townshend Act, save for the indemnity clause. The radical innovation was introduced in the provision which empowered the East India Company, if they so chose, to export tea to America or to foreign parts from their warehouses and on their own account upon obtaining a license from the commissioners of the Treasury. In other words, the East India Company, which hitherto had been required by law to sell their teas at public auction to merchants for exportation, were now authorized to become their own exporters and to establish branch houses in America. This arrangement swept away by one stroke the English merchant who purchased the tea at the company's auction and the American merchant who bought it of the English merchant. For the East India Company, by dealing directly with the American retailer, eliminated all the profits which ordinarily accumulated in the passage of the tea through the hands of the middlemen. From another point of view, as Joseph Galloway has pointed out, the consumer of tea in America was obliged to pay only one profit to the company, another to the shopkeeper. But before the act, they usually paid a profit to the company, to the London merchant, who bought it of the company and sold it to the American merchant, and also to the American merchants besides the profit of the retailer. So that by this act, the consumer of this necessary and common article of subsistence was enabled to purchase it at 1/2 of its usual price. It is clear thus that the only new element introduced into the situation by the new act was the provision which made it possible for the American consumer to buy duty teas imported directly by the East India Company at a cheaper rate than duty teas imported in the customary manner by private merchants or than Dutch teas introduced by the illicit traders. Therefore, when the colonial press announced in September 1773 that the East India Company had been licensed to export more than 500,000 pounds of tea to the 4 leading ports of America, an alliance of powerful interests at once appeared in opposition to the company's shipments. As Governor Hutchinson at Boston put it in a letter of January 2nd, 1774, our Liberty men had lost their reputation with Philadelphia and New York, having been importers of tea from England for 3 or 4 years past, notwithstanding the engagement they had entered into to the contrary. As soon as the news came of the intended exportation of teas by the East India Company, which must of course put an end to all trade in teas by private merchants, proposals were made both to Philadelphia and York for a new union, and they were readily accepted. For although no teas had been imported from England at either of those places, yet an immense profit had been made by the importation from Holland, which would entirely cease if the teas from the East India Company should be admitted. This was the consideration which engaged all the merchants. An extended controversy began in newspaper and broadside, which not only revealed the fundamental antagonism between the undertaking of the British Trading Corporation and the interests of the colonial tea merchants, but also pointed out the far-reaching menace which the new act held for American merchants in general. To broaden the basis of the popular protest, the old theoretical arguments against the taxing authority of Parliament were exhumed, and new and bizarre arguments were invented. An examination of the propagandist literature and of a few private letters will bear out this preliminary analysis. Most of the writings against the tea shipments issued from the print shops of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and with varying emphasis, covered substantially the same ground. The Charleston newspapers reprinted many of the Northern arguments, and the events there may therefore be said to have been determined in large part by the same sentiments. At Boston, the newspaper writers laid great stress on the fact that the legitimate traffic in English teas was assailed with destructive competition. A consistent patriot declared that the new statute would displace the men in the American tea trade and force them to seek their living elsewhere, in order to make room for an East India factor, probably from North Britain, to thrive upon what are now the honest gains of our own merchants. Surely, all the London merchants trading to America and all the American merchants trading with Britain, said Reclusus, must highly resent such a monopoly, considered only as it affects their private interest, and without regard to the fact that everyone who buys the tea will be paying tribute to the harpy commissioners and to Parliament. The newly appointed tea consignees can't seriously imagine that the merchants will quietly see themselves excluded from a considerable branch of trade, that they and the odious commissioners may riot in luxury. A merchant expressed surprise that the merchants and traders had not met to take action in the crisis. Among other commercial ills, that those gentlemen that have dealt in that article will altogether be deprived of the benefit arising from such business. The loyalist town of Hinsdale, New Hampshire, resolved unanimously that the tumult against the tea was not due to objections against a revenue tax, but because the intended method of sale in this country by the East India Company probably would hurt the private interest of many persons who deal largely in tea. At New York and Philadelphia, the chief smuggling ports, greater emphasis was placed on the threatened ruin awaiting the illicit tea traffic. The Philadelphia merchant Thomas Wharton pointed out that it is impossible always to form a true judgment from what real motives an opposition springs, as the smugglers and London importers may both declare that this duty is stamping the Americans with the badge of slavery. A tea commissioner at Boston believed that the agitation against the act was fomented, if not originated, principally by those persons concerned in the Holland trade, a trade much more practiced in the southern governments than this way. A citizen conceded cautiously in the New York Journal of November 11, 1773, that we have not been hitherto altogether at the mercy of those monopolists, the East India Company, because it has been worth the while for others to supply us with tea at a more reasonable price, but that hereafter, if tea should be brought us from any foreign market, the East India Company might occasionally undersell those concerned in it so as to ruin or deter them from making many experiments of the kind. A loyalist writer expressed the same thoughts from a different point of view when he affirmed to the people of New York that every measure of the radical cabal is an undoubted proof that not your liberties but their private interest is the object. To create an odium against the British company is the main point at which they have labored. They have too richly experienced the fruits which may be reaped from a contraband trade, to relinquish them to others without a struggle. One of the tea commissioners at New York declared that the introduction of the East India Company's tea is violently opposed here by a set of men who shamefully live by monopolizing tea in the smuggling way. Governor Tryon and others entertained a similar opinion. To rob the new law of the appeal it held for the pocketbooks of the tea purchasers, the writers impeached the good faith of the company in undercutting prices. Reclusus predicted confidently that though the first teas may be sold at a low rate to make a popular entry, yet when this mode of receiving tea is well established, they, as all other monopolists do, will meditate a greater profit on their goods and set them up at what price they please. Hampden wrote, "Nor let it be said to cajole the poor that this importation of tea will lower the price of it. Is any temporary abatement of that to be weighed in the balance with the permanent loss that will attend the sole monopoly of it in future, which will enable them abundantly to reimburse themselves by raising the price as high as their known avarice may dictate?" In the words of Mucius, every purchaser must be at their mercy. The India Company would not undertake to pay the duty in England or America, pay enormous fees to commissioners, etc., etc., unless they were well assured that the Americans would in the end reimburse them for every expense their unreasonable project should bring along with it. The writers sought to show that the present project of the East India Company was the entering wedge for larger and more ambitious undertakings calculated to undermine the colonial mercantile world. Their opinion was based on the fact that in addition to the article of tea, the East India Company imported into England vast quantities of silk, calicos, and other fabrics, spices, drugs, and chinaware, all commodities of staple demand. And on their fear that the success of the present venture would result in an extension of the same principle to the sale of the other articles, perhaps no argument had greater weight than this, nor indeed was such a development beyond the range of possibility. If they succeed in their present experiment with tea, argued a mechanic, they will send their own factors and creatures, establish houses among us, ship us all other East India goods, and in order to full freight their ships, take in other kind of goods at under freight, or more probably ship them on their own accounts to their own factors and undersell our merchants till they monopolize the whole trade. Thus our merchants are ruined, shipbuilding ceases. They will then sell goods at any exorbitant price. Our artificers will be unemployed, and every tradesman will groan under dire oppression. Hampden warned the New Yorkers, "If you receive the portion of tea designed for the city, you will in future have an India warehouse here, and the trade of all the commodities of that country will be lost to your merchants and be carried on by the company, which will be an immense loss to the colony." A customs commissioner writing to the home government from Boston noted that it was pretended that when once the East India Company has established warehouses for the sale of tea, all other articles commonly imported from the East Indies and saleable in America will be sent there by the company. That the fear of monopoly was the mainspring of American opposition is further evidenced by the trend of discussion in the early weeks before it was known definitely that the new law provided for the retention of the 3-pence import duty. The report gained currency that the tea shipped by the East India Company was to be introduced free of the American import duty. This understanding was based upon a misreading of that portion of the statute which empowered the company to export such tea to any of the British colonies or plantations in America, or to foreign parts, discharged from the payment of any customs or duties whatsoever, anything in the said recited act, or any other act, to the contrary notwithstanding. Had this been a correct interpretation of the law, there is every reason to believe that the course of American opposition would have developed unchanged, and the tea would then have been dumped into the Atlantic as an undisguised and unmixed protest against a grasping trading monopoly.